Panel consists of, from left to right, David Harvey, Peter Marcuse, Susan Fainstein, and Margit Mayer. Oh, Peter Marcuse.
I want to comment on two things having to do with the title of this conference. One is what radical urbanism is, and the other is what the Right to the City Alliance is. What radical urbanism is, I don't want to try to convince you in the time I have that it is the right analysis of what is going on in the world, although I think it is. I do want to convince you that it's a coherent explanation of what is going on in the world, and particularly in the urban area in which much of what goes on in the world is congealed. And I want to be a little more specific about it and suggest that while it has a great deal in common with liberal and communitarian and other critical approaches to the analysis of urban issues, it has also some clear distinctions. And those distinctions seem to me to be important, and I would list 5 as of particular significance. The first is that it connects issues and developments together and sees them as interrelated. I was at a discussion at Columbia a couple of weeks ago where Stephen Greenhouse, who's the labor reporter for the New York Times, spoke. He's done a very good book called The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for American Workers, which is full of both data and anecdotes about the difficulties that have been caused to working people in the U.S. These days. But it struck me as on the liberal side of the liberal radical line. He said, he started out by saying, in the 6 years after November 2001, we see a big disconnect. Corporate profits nearly doubled. Productivity per workers rose 18%, while wages remained flat. And he went on to argue that that was immoral and how bad it was. But disconnect, it seems to me the radical formulation is, we have seen in the last 10 years that corporate profits have doubled because of the benefit of workers' productivity, which has been captured by corporations who have thus doubled their profits. That relationship of exploitation between those who profit on the corporate level and those who suffer at the working level, it seems to me is central to a radical explanation of what is happening. The second characteristic I would want to emphasize is that the system can be named, and that the name of the system is not a free market system, nor, although it speaks to a different dimension of it, nor is it a democratic system. The name of the system is capitalism. It's a term that has fallen out of fashion by and large in our discussions, but it seems to me when the Washington Post can put on its front page a headline reading, "Is American Capitalism Dead?" then we can also take it as part of legitimate discourse. The boundary of legitimate discourse, I think, is pretty flexible and getting broader, and when somebody like Huntington can say it is the Mexican presence in the U.S. that is subversive and that is a threat to the United States, that's broadening limits of the logically permissible pretty widely. But it is not stretching those limits to speak of capitalism, and I think to the extent that it's a correct analysis, it ought to be said more often. Thirdly, the question of the alternatives, and this is a big one. We tend to speak of alternatives in terms of the immediately feasible, and thus the mild alternatives are a little more regulation, and the big alternative is a lot more regulation, but regulation of the same thing. And the suggestion that there is an alternative, that it isn't the regulation of the thing, but the thing itself that needs to be changed, I think is a radical approach. The fourth issue that I think distinguishes radical approaches is a view of democracy and decision-making that does not aim, at least in the foreseeable future, at a consensus. I say this in particular for those of us that deal in urban planning and the kind of program I teach in, where there is a real strain that defines planning as achieving consensus around specific issues of development. I think that is dead wrong and inconsistent with the way the world works, at least as radical approaches see it. Changes are not all win-win changes and ought not to be seen that way. They ought to be seen as changes in which what helps some is likely to hurt others. What's at issue is a change in power relations. Those are not win-win changes. Those are win-lose changes. And the purpose is that some will lose and others will win. I'm glad you don't need to be convinced. And the final point that's connected with that was an early paper that I wrote called The Myth of the Benevolent State. And it critiqued the idea that the history of policy, both on urban issues and generally, was a history of a benevolent state gradually learning over time how better to achieve benevolent goals. And in each year, we learn from our past mistakes and get better and better at what we do. The implication is that the way to influence decisions is through rational persuasion. Nothing wrong with rational persuasion. I think it needs to be used, but I think it would be a fallacy and a delusion to think that it is rational persuasion that will change relations of power. I think we need all the arguments we can muster. We need also all the organization we can muster, all the power that we have, both economically and politically. Persuasion will help with some, but it will not be, at least if addressed to the state, will not be that which will convince, that which will shape the policies of the incoming administration will not be the eloquence or articulateness of the way in which we present what we think ought to be done. It will lie in the mobilization that is behind those programs. So that's at least the way I see radical urbanism, what radical means. It seems to me a coherent, logical, viable explanation. If there are others, you should explore them, and if you find a better, fine. Please let me and others know. The second question I wanted to address has to do with the Right to the City Alliance. The alliance word is one that is based on a national group in the United States, which brings together groups both geographically, spatially, and sectorally by area of deprivation and area of issue. It brings together homeless groups, gay and lesbian groups, immigrant groups, students, in an alliance. And the question is this alliance, or is this conceptualization a formulation of who the agent of change would be, of who the actors are, what the entities are that can, in fact, implement, I've spoken of expose, propose, politicize. When we politicize, who is going to be the political force that will implement what we propose? And I think that needs careful analysis. It is not simply a question of who happens to come to a rally we call around some issue on which we're all agreed. Help for those suffering in New Orleans after Katrina. You call a meeting and it's called by the Right to the City Alliance, and that's its constituency. We've got to go beyond that. I think it takes an analysis of who, both objectively and subjectively, is likely to be on the side of wishing to implement a radical urban program. And I think there are two ways of looking at the definition of those with an interest in fundamental change. One is to include the materially deprived. Generally along class lines, we're used to looking at income inequality. We're not quite as used to looking at class relations, or using the word exploitation, but it has to do with material goods and their distribution and the manner of their distribution, and to some extent the manner of their production as well. It certainly has its source in their manner of production. That's one basis, and to the extent that people understand that some people are poor because they are exploited by others who are rich or who are in a different relationship to the forces of production, I think that's a solid basis for understanding who is likely to be among those supporting fundamental change. What is needed is a recognition that the source of their exploitation, the source of inequality, is a common one and is called capitalism. The others that are likely to be involved in movements for fundamental change, that are plausible actors, are people like most of those in this room who are not appropriately, relatively called materially deprived, but who might be, if they indulged in self-reflection, might consider themselves as culturally oppressed, limited in the freedom to choose what they want to do with their lives, limited in the way they can express their creativity, limited in the ways in which they are treated by others that ought to see them as equals and colleagues, but in fact see them in narrow, defined, and rigidly constrained relationships. And it seems to me a critical task, and one that I hope this conference will help us to face up to, is bringing together those who are materially deprived and those who are culturally oppressed. I include under culturally oppressed simply those that feel that we live in a world with mammoth injustices that need to be remedied, and that are uncomfortable if they don't act towards a remedy of those injustices. I think what's needed is to bring those groups together into the kind of movements, the beginnings of which we saw, for instance, in 1968 in Paris, in Berlin, in New York at Columbia. I think one needs, in bringing those groups together, to give priority to the immediate needs of those who are materially deprived. That is, I don't think that the demand for student participation in departmental government should have precedence over the demand for housing for the homeless. But I think the two demands do need to come together, ultimately, if fundamental change is to be achieved. And I think we can expect to be successful in that effort, ultimately. The formulation was already quoted here earlier today. We are many and they are few. We are many and they are few, and the figures that Bill Tabb just gave show us a little bit how few they are. And we are many. There's certainly a lot of us here. And if all of those that are here continue with a commitment to deal with the injustices and inequities that we see about us, that are increasing, as we have heard, and that can be remedied because there are alternatives that analysis would suggest, then I think we will have really accomplished something. I would hope that that the formulation expose, propose, politicize that I've suggested earlier might be one formulation of how to do that. The students have put little stickers in many of the programs that say expose, propose, politicize, and might be a good thing to have on your refrigerator. But certainly a good thing to do, and if we can contribute to that process by conferences such as this, we will have accomplished a good bit. I'll stop there. I very much want to hear the others on this panel, who are probably the four people from whom I have learned the most in the course of my career in this field. I can't help mentioning one incident that came before I met anybody here except my wife. And that is that in one summer, while I was in law school, I got a job in a small factory in Brooklyn, ended up organizing the workers there in a union whose latest effort you have just heard about in Chicago, the United Electrical Workers. It should be pointed out that the United Electrical Workers were one of a substantial number of left-wing unions that were decimated by the Taft-Hartley Act in the McCarthy period after the Second World War. And it is very heartening to see them not only surviving, but also holding aloft the banner of militancy, as they've just done in Chicago. But I want to hear the others on the panel, particularly David Harvey. I've got to say that David's Social Justice in the City was for me, the critical book when I was getting my PhD that I think steered my direction in the field, and that I think is still one of the foundational texts in the field. Thanks.
So let me introduce Margit Mayer to you. Margit teaches at the Free University in Berlin on North American politics, comparative politics. Her research also is very much focused on urban and regional issues, and in that context she's been an editor of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Affairs, which many of you will be familiar with. The more specific kinds of topics that Margit deals with include local state theory, urban social movements, restructuring of public-private relations in cities, restructuring of welfare and state regimes.
So the three features I have singled out that seem to me important about understanding the contemporary situation is, one, the state's response so far; two, the Great Recession and how it is seen by capital, who at this point anyway seems to be the major actor in defining and reacting to the Great Recession; and thirdly, our actual topic, urban conflict and local social movements. The state, obviously a huge topic. It's been looked at from various perspectives, but some of them haven't been sufficiently highlighted. Not only has the state in the course of the last 3 decades been shrinking, materially been shrinking, but more important even, it's been reorienting from welfare to workfare, and it's been strongly orienting towards corporate welfare. But it has also been doing the opposite of shrinking in terms of, well, the neoliberal elites have been very foresightful in expanding the repressive apparatus, the surveillance apparatus of the state. Police forces have grown, and all kinds of special forces have been growing in countries not only as neoliberal and neoconservative as in yours, but also across European so-called more social democratic countries. Even the Nordic countries have seen growth of zero tolerance and developments of new surveillance technologies, new weapons, tasering, and some of them were mentioned by the comrade from New Orleans, where these new kinds of instruments have been employed. But in Germany too, we had academics who, simply for doing research on gentrification, were jailed under the new terrorism law. These are no mere accidents. The reduction of civil liberties and the restriction of political freedoms, the reduction of the right to demonstrate, are all part of a strategy building up the important tools and institutions and legal frameworks to deal with what is going to come as reactions to the Great Recession. We are already seeing it now to how the militant protests in Greece, but also in Denmark and lots of other civilized European countries are met with massive police forces, sometimes accompanied by right-wing gangs that go out and help the police. So that part of the development of the state's response needs to be in the forefront of our minds when we talk about how to assess and how to think about responding to the contemporary situation. The second element I find interesting, reading the Financial Times on my flight here, I came across an article that interpreted the current recession against the background of the lessons learned in reaction to the last 2 recessions. We talk about roll back neoliberalism as characterizing the 80s, and then roll out neoliberalizing as characterizing the 90s, and currently the leftist academics aren't sure whether to call it zombie neoliberalism because it's still dominant even though it's dead. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. In this article, a lesson of the 81-82 recession was seen in that it heralded the end of the notion of a job for life. That's when the free agent came in, flexible working became the norm, and so on and so forth. The 1991 recession accelerated this, but it added globalization, and so costs were cut by moving work out of the developed countries into emerging nations. So offshoring at first of just low-cost work, and then increasingly also talent in IT and research and development was outshored to India and other countries. The current recession of 2008-09 is interpreted as also opening up the opportunity for getting us used to things that people were resistant without what Naomi Klein would call the shock of a real crisis. And now, it's not just workers that have to give up everything that they have been struggling for centuries, but also some of the capitalists have to regroup and learn a couple lessons. I mean, the interpretation in that particular Wednesday's Financial Times article was rather benign. They were talking about groupware technologies and that maybe the talent of young students will no longer go into banking as much as it did in the last epoch, but maybe into more sustainable fields. But I think what it did not mention is that unions will lose all of the achievements, and that had been mentioned in some of the papers we heard earlier. So finally, what does this mean then for urban conflict and social movements? Of course, the media has it all wrong when they report on the burning of the Greek cities and all over Europe, that these are mere anarchist troublemakers. My inbox is exploding over the last week with email messages from organizations like Radical Europe and INURA, the International Network of Urban and Regional Action, and of Planners Network, and Right to the City, and similar organizations that are networked with each other and that are coordinating these, not independently of each other, springing up actions of occupying embassies here and attacking symbols of neoliberalism in the various downtowns. There are connections between the different local movements, even though there is no top-down Obama-like machine telling the grassroots where to go. But still, it is now a question of, are these networks and all these various organizations, even though they are somewhat connected, are they going to be able to push this further? One last word on this. The people on the streets in Greek cities, but also all over Europe, are in and of themselves, many of them, representing both categories of what Peter divided as the materially deprived and the culturally oppressed. The youth of today are both culturally oppressed and very much materially deprived because, in spite of their higher education, they don't have decent job prospectus at all. So it may be much easier to bridge those divisions than it used to be in the golden age of Fordism. But my time is long up, and so I will stop here.
There is Susan Fainstein, who's a professor of planning in the Graduate School of Design at Harvard.
What we're really concerned here with is what program would be transformative and would increase justice, increase equity, given a social context. And here I'm not talking about countries where the majority of people are in the informal economy, but rather where the majority of people, as in the United States, as in Europe, are in fact within the formal economy. Manning Marabell said that, and Peter quoted it in this panel, that we should unite the many to defeat the few. Well, if we're only talking about the people who are CEOs of financial institutions, yes, of course, that's the few. But if we're talking about the 47% of the voting population who voted for McCain, we're not talking about the few. We're talking about quite a number of people. And so it therefore raises the question of how do we recreate what Brecker referred to as a global social bloc. I think that at the end, Peter, when he was talking just now and talking about radical urbanism, said, well, we're not searching for consensus, we're searching for democracy, and that there but a certain kind of democracy in which there are winners and losers. But there is a question of how many the losers will be and how much conflict one is willing to, in fact, endure in order to change the balance of power. It would seem to me that in addition to the material deprived, who have been the groups that we focused on in most of the panels today, that one has to include a large number of those people who are not materially deprived and don't actually necessarily consider themselves culturally oppressed. And I was trying to think, do I consider myself culturally oppressed or not? And I'm not sure that I do. Or I may feel myself as culturally oppressed sometimes among my leftist friends as among my Harvard ones. But at any rate, I think where there really is an organizing possibility and where many people do in fact feel oppressed and anxious, and we're talking now about a large proportion of the population, has to do with what Margit was speaking of, the flexibility of the workforce and the insecurity that people who have what used to be seen as good jobs or jobs which had high educational prerequisites now are in very insecure jobs. And so it's connecting with the people who, because of the changing character of work under capitalism as we now know it, whether it's pre-Fordist, post-Fordist, Fordist, or whichever we want to label it, but which are really seeing a huge change in the expectations that they can have from the contemporary economy. And so I think that in terms of identifying the historical actor, that we have to enlarge our focus beyond saying, well, a majority of the country is going to be of an ethnic minority, which does not seem to me, in fact, to be that form of sort of identification. And a parenthesis here, I have at Harvard a number of people who are parts of minority Asian groups and minority Latino groups, however they happen to come from the very upper strata of those populations. And every time we hear a spokesperson for an investment bank, he's almost invariably South Asian. So that I think that we instead have to look at the very large number of people who are in different economic circumstances and different industries, but are characterized by this feeling of extreme insecurity. And that together with them, in fact, we might say that we are the many, and then the others are the few. Thank you.
Next speaker is David Harvey. Among David's books, which many of you will know are obviously Social Justice in the City, one of my favorites is Explanation in Geography, which I'll bet none of you have ever read, from 1969. I don't necessarily recommend it, but Limits to Capital, and a few other minor pieces in the middle, including Condition of Postmodernity, and more recently, Paris, Capital of Modernity. there's so much to be said about David. I'm just going to leave it there.
My version of neoliberalism was that it was always about the restoration and consolidation of class power. And within that, there were all sorts of tactics and rhetorics, which were largely mystifications of what was really going on. And what was really going on, I think, was brilliantly revealed by Bill Tabb in his book about the long default of New York, in which it became clear that the role of finance was crucial, and that the role of government was to support finance at all costs, and that if there was a conflict between the well-being of financial institutions and the well-being of the people, you chose the financial institutions and you screwed the people. And as Bill pointed out, this kind of tactic, which worked in the New York fiscal crisis, became sort of the way in which the IMF then went out and did structural adjustment around the world everywhere, beginning in Mexico in 1982 and then all over the place ever since. Now, if you take that particular view of neoliberalism, then when you look at the bailout of the financial institutions, you would say this is just going on all over again. It's just bigger this time than before. And frankly, when those 8 guys came out of the room with that 3-page document explaining why it was we had to give them $700 billion, and 2 of those guys were, one of them was the ex-head of Goldman Sachs, and the other is the current head of what even the New York Times refers to now as Government Sachs. It seemed to me like we were actually living through a financial coup against the people of the United States. And we should start to represent it and think about it in those terms. And when you think about it in those terms, you see this massive amount of money which is flowing to the support of financial institutions, bailing them out. And yes, some of them are hurting, but as mentioned earlier, what we're going to end up with is an incredible consolidation of class power. Now, there's a great line, which I think it was Andrew Mellon said way back in 1911 or something like that, about a crisis. And he kind of said, in a crisis, assets return to their rightful owners. What this really means, and this is actually true about the whole history of capitalism, that crises have not necessarily been about the destruction of capital. They've been about the reconfiguration of capital. And in fact, crises are the irrational rationalizers of the whole capitalist dynamic. And we have to think about it in those terms in order to recognize that what's going on right now is the search for some irrational rationalization so that that class power is not going to be in any way challenged. It is going to be consolidated. It's going to be, I always said securitized, but I guess that has a wrong connotation in these financial times. But if we think of it in those terms, then it seems to me we have to look at this crisis as not the end of anything, but in a sense the culmination and the next step along a particular line. And actually, this has been going on, of course, since the 1970s. And I think there's just a couple of things I would want to say about that long history, because again, the issue in the late 1960s, 1970s in Europe and in here was indeed the question of labor organization, the question of labor scarcities and all the rest of it, and there were all sorts of ways in which means were sort of explored as to how to deal with the labor question and the power of labor. And part of it was, well, technological change is a good way to do it. I mean, you can create unemployment that way. Another way is, of course, immigration. And I remind you, the reform of the Immigration Act in this country in 1965 gave this country access to the world's global labor force to come in. In Europe, for example, the Germans brought in the Turks, the French brought in the Maghrebians, all under state subsidy. The Yugoslavs went to Sweden, and so there were all kinds of mechanisms. And then if you couldn't do it that way, you offshored, and you took the stuff to China or the Maquila zones or something like that. So there's a tremendous struggle over the labor issue there, which culminated, of course, that if none of those technical means worked, you invented people like Reagan and Thatcher and Pinochet, who smashed the union movement and destroyed the power of labor, and really then launched also this incredible ideological campaign about freedom of the market and personal responsibility and all the stuff that we've been sort of told is good for us about that particular commodity, that particular kind of economy. Now, one of the consequences of this was, to the degree that that attack upon labor won, by the time you get to around 1980 or so, and was winning out, the capitalist class was beginning then to rake in very high profits. And you see, one of the peculiar things about this was that what this led to was, again, something that Peter mentioned. We've been through 30 years, in effect, of wage repression. That is, real wages haven't risen anywhere really very much. I mean, occasionally here, occasionally there, but real wages have stagnated in the face of rising productivity and all the rest of it. So all of the benefits of this have gone to an increasingly smaller group in the capitalist class, and everybody knows about all of the incredible increases in inequality that have occurred and the tremendous amount of assets that have been sort of accumulated by this sort of top 0.1%. Now, one of the things that people then say is, well, you know, what Bush would say is, well, those people, you need to give them the money because they're the ones who are going to invest and reinvest in the economy. But they don't. What they do is they invest in assets, and they drive up asset prices. You know, they invest in the stock market, and stock prices go up, and they say, oh, this looks like a good bet, so they invest more in the stock market, and then more in the stock market, so the stock market just goes up. And when the stock market goes down, they say, well, let's look around somewhere else, or the property market. You know, we can start doing that. So you invest in assets, and what you do is you drive asset values up and up and up. And as asset values get driven up and up and up, that makes it very difficult for the rest of us who are not in that kind of class to actually find some place to live if they're driving up the asset prices. I mean, they drive up asset prices of all kinds of things. You know, the art market goes up, Picassos go up, the value of trophy wives goes up, since most of these people are very are all guys, you know. So that's one of the ways in which they spend their money too. So this is I think one of the dilemmas that we've now been in, that actually what you end up with is a very interesting kind of dilemma. And this is sort of a simple version of Marx, and it's not quite correct. But if you repress wages, then you've got a problem in your market. Who are you going to sell the stuff to? I mean, and even Henry Ford realized it was important to have sort of well-paid workers in order to absorb your product. But if you're repressing wages, then the big question is, well, who are you going to sell to? And the only answer they could come up with was, well, you've got to get the working classes to borrow. So in fact, you go into a massive indebtedness, and you manufacture credit cards and things like that, and you lure people into the sort of credit economy. So if you look at household indebtedness in the United States right now, you'd see it's 3 or 4 times what it was in, say, 1980. And credit card debt is at about 10 times what it was in 1980. So that actually what you do is you cover the gap between the production of value and the realization of value by having more and more people borrow, which in effect then sort of puts the onus upon the financial institutions. And then there's a funny kind of thing that emerges where the financial institutions start to operate at both ends of the cycle of capital. That is, they lend the money to people at the outset, and they then lend money to people to purchase the stuff at the end. Think of that in housing, for example. You lend money to a speculative developer, and they develop vast amounts of tract housing outside of San Diego, and then they say, my God, you know, we're going to lose all this money unless we can find somebody to buy it. Who the hell's got the money to buy it? Well, nobody's got the money to buy it, so therefore we'll get it bought up with subprime mortgages and all the rest of it. So you start to operate in both ends of the thing. So that then becomes, if you like, part of what the dynamic is about. Now, what this then leads to is that actually right now, underlying what is happening now is what I would call a realization crisis of capitalism. Is a problem in the market. And we're going to have, I think, therefore, an attempt to solve that by a Keynesian strategy. And you can see elements of that already emerging. Now, there are 2 difficulties, it seems to me, between a Keynesian strategy going on in this country. About the only country that could do a Keynesian strategy would be China, and for reasons which will shortly become clear. In this country, if you really wanted to launch a Keynesian strategy, one of the first things you'd have to do is you'd have to rebalance the income inequalities. In other words, you'd have to start engaging in massive redistributions of wealth from the upper classes to the working classes. That would be absolutely essential. And in fact, that's the only thing that really kind of worked finally in the Great Depression, is when some of that started to happen, particularly during World War II and after World War II. Some of that started to happen, and that's what rescued capitalism then. Now, is Obama going to be prepared to do that? What is it the Republican Party is saying right now about the bailout? We want to smash the unions even worse. We want to really nail them down. We want to really screw them. And actually, Obama's going to have a very, very hard time, spreading the wealth around. I mean, God, all that stuff about spreading the wealth around, and so it's going to be very hard for that to go through. But even harder is going to be, you can't launch a Keynesian strategy when you are so incredibly indebted already that you really cannot afford to go even that much further into debt. I mean, this country is borrowing probably around $3 billion a day right now in order to cover its indebtedness. And you're going to say, okay, we're going to have a huge Keynesian program. We're going to have to borrow sort of $5 or $6 billion a day. Where the hell is it going to come from? Are the Chinese really going to give it to us? Are the Japanese going to give it to us? Real problem. The only way in which you could actually launch a program of this kind and at the same time do something about the deficit is you'd have to cut your military expenditures in half. You'd have to get out of Iraq, certainly not go into Afghanistan, and actually just savage the military budget. That's the only place you can go. Do you think Obama's going to do that? My God, the mess that would, the political outrage if he ever tried to do something like that. So actually, a real Keynesian strategy in this country is forestalled. It can't really happen. Now, the Chinese have the surpluses. They can recapitalize their banks. They can indeed put in vast public works programs. They can put in employment programs. They can do that. And they're likely to do that for one very simple reason, that the state of unrest in China, particularly in the Pearl River Delta, where factories are closing down and massive unemployment is emerging, the Chinese are very, very, very nervous about the political consequences of that. So they may engage in their own Keynesian strategy for their own kinds of reasons, and they can do it. We can't. But if they're going to do it there, they ain't going to do it here. So they ain't going to lend us the money either here. So there's going to be a real problem on the international dimension about all of this. Now, I've mentioned the way in which asset prices get bid up. Since the 1970s, there's been what I would call a capital surplus absorption problem. The more and more capital the capitalist classes got, the less they could figure out what the hell to do with it. So actually, if you look very carefully since the 1970s and ask yourself, how many financial crises have there been around the world? And I don't know what it is. It's probably around the order of 40 or 50 of them in different parts of the world. And then you ask, how many of them were actually property market-based? The answer is a good 50% of them are property market-based. I mean, the Swedish banking system went bankrupt in 1992 because of excessive speculation in property markets. The Japanese boom came to an end at the end of the 1980s through excessive land and property speculation. Even the 1997-98 South Asian had a big property component to it. So again and again and again, you find these crises, as they come out, have this property base, which leads me to say straight off that we should stop talking about the subprime mortgage crisis and talk about it as an urban crisis, because when you look at the patterns of the foreclosures, you'll see a kind of a difference between what's going on in Florida and California and San Diego and so on, which is this tract housing, that sort of thing, or the new condominiums and so on, and what was going on in the older cities like Baltimore or Cleveland and so on, where as I would sort of refer to it, there's been, in effect, a financial Katrina, that actually whole neighborhoods have been completely wiped out, and it's nearly always either Hispanics or African-American neighborhoods have been completely destroyed. And that destruction which has gone on has destroyed not only sort of individual houses, but like I say, whole neighborhoods. And so there's a huge kind of urban dynamic which is going on here, which we should be paying, I think, a lot of very close attention to that dynamic. Now, what does this mean when we bring it back to the urban? I think on this, I would want to say that the notion of the right to the city is one of the ways in which it seems to me we can start to organize around a whole set of these questions about, for example, what to do in these semi-destroyed or in some cases totally destroyed neighborhoods, what to do about people who've been displaced and dislodged by this foreclosure movement and all the rest of it. And it seems to me there are some strategies which we can start to really think about. I would be in favor, for example, of really campaigning nationwide to get municipalities to pass anti-eviction laws. Just think what a difference that would make. Alongside that, to say, look, municipalities should be setting up sort of housing corporations that can take over the foreclosed properties, can pay off the banks at 60 cents on the dollar, and then allow people to have the continuous right to live in the place where they were living all along. In other words, what we should be doing is starting to look at, say, some sort of modifications to things like city charters that give a right of continuity of residence, and actually attach, as René said earlier, the notion of citizenship to the notion of residence. And at the same time, secure residence. But in order to do a lot of that, we have a huge kind of ideological battle on our hands about things like private ownership and what private ownership is about. And and this idea that the only thing that secures you a right to be in the city is to be a property owner has to be attacked in all kinds of ways. Now, this brings me back, it seems to me, to what the central problem is. I think the exit of the current crisis is already determined. It's already figured. It's already prefigured. It's on its way. And I can see various elements of that. The one thing where they cannot, this time, make it work as easily as they did in the past is there's a legitimation crisis. There's a serious legitimation crisis. How do you legitimate what is happening right now? The failure to deal with General Motors and without even any oversight whatsoever, giving billions of dollars to the financial institutions. How do you legitimize that, for God's sake? How do you do it? So I think we're moving into a phase right now of a legitimation crisis, which is where people like us come in. We have a very acute role to play in really emphasizing that this system is about raw, naked class power located in the financial institutions, and there are a few of them, and they have an immense power, and indeed, they can play all kinds of ideological games through the media and so on, and the media at the moment is still kind of stuck trying to interpret everything in exactly the same terms as it was like before. In other words, there's an attempt to, as it were, say, well, nothing is really changing here, when actually things are changing. And it's at this particular moment that we do have to be prepared to use words like capitalism, even socialism or communism. We have to talk about socializing housing and socializing education. We have to talk about socializing healthcare. We have to talk about those things. Now, how you do it and whether you do it in a decentralized way or a centralized way, how you fund it and so on, lots of questions to be asked, but we have to be prepared to talk about all of those issues. Because if not, what we're simply going to get coming out of this crisis is simply they have prepared their arcs. They're floating very nicely where they are. They've consolidated their class power. They're okay. Don't believe these stories that just because one of the CEOs has had to sell his art collection, they're running into hard times. They're not at all. They're doing fine. And actually, there's some banks in this city, Lazard's, for example, is doing beautifully right now. It's had the best business years of ever, because one of their skills is trying to value toxic assets. And there's a very high demand for their services these days, and they're charging very high premium for it. They're making out like bandits on this whole thing. And so when we look at that, we say, all right, look, these are the things we have to start to really confront. They're doing fine. The rest of us are going to have to pay. And it was great when they occupied we should start doing what they did in Argentina. We should start occupying all these damn factories. We should start doing what they did in Buenos Aires when the collapses occurred there, which is organizing whole neighborhoods around sustaining some sort of economy of reciprocity in a situation of dire circumstances. In other words, those are the things that have to start happening, and we have to be prepared to talk about them and talk about it in a way which is really prepared fundamentally to say, in response to Margaret Thatcher's notion that there is no alternative, there goddamn better be one, or we're going to really make a mess of this world as well.
It seems to me that this economic crisis was predictable. There's actually a whole literature of mostly Marxist analysis, but leftist analysis relying on Marx one way or another, that made it very clear that the situation in the early to mid years of the 2000s, first years of this century, it was unsustainable, to use that dreadful language. It was totally unsustainable in capitalist terms, and it was predictable. Now, I'm well aware, too, that there's a whole history of Marxists themselves being slightly self-critical along the following kinds of lines, that Marxists have predicted 10 out of the last 4 recessions. And I think we're really only at the beginning of this economic crisis. The next huge crisis probably looks like a credit card debt crisis, and who knows where that'll lead. The other one, which is already unfolding, is the fiscal crisis of cities, but of states and of governmental bodies, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. It's a crisis that I think is difficult to predict. It's difficult to predict the depth of that crisis. The United States right now is sitting on top of some $5.8 trillion of debt, which, if that debt were to be valued at zero, the US government would have to pay back. That represents more now than probably 40% of what the gross domestic product of the country is going to be this year. That's an extraordinary situation to be happening. The dollar is the only currency that stayed strong of all the major currencies. And should something happen to the dollar, and it's extraordinary to me, my economist friends, Bill Tabb and others, have all said, the dollar's going to stay up. I'm not convinced, but should the dollar go down, the repercussions economically are quite extraordinary. Again, it's radically unsure what's going to happen. We know the crisis is going to deepen. Quite the directions it takes, the troughs through which it leads in particular, I think are not so clear. The other thing I think that's very important is that, yes, indeed, this is an urban crisis, but it's a social crisis.